Okay, in your readings you had to deal with one article by Thomas Nagel and then another concerning the moral thought of David Hume. And I want to take up David Hume here. And so we're addressing the good, the right, and the ought, as always. And the title of this particular talk is David Hume, the so-called fact-value divide, or some people call it Hume's guillotine, and how we would engage with that idea, and also the idea of keeping our ethical edge sharp. So it's really doubtful that Hume could ever have anticipated the status that would be accorded to his one short paragraph in a very large book that he wrote called A Treatise of Human Nature. He said of that book that it fell stillborn from the presses, and so it became much more popular after he died than it was during his lifetime. And from it, this one little excerpt was taken, which became an orthodoxy in a certain branch of philosophy, an analytic philosophy. So here's the quote. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary ways of reasoning and establishes the being of a god, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when all of a sudden I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that's not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible. He's saying it just happens all of a sudden, but it is, however, of the last consequence, meaning it's very important. For as this ought or ought not, that expresses some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained, at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. So the point being, you can't move from states of affairs to you ought or ought not on the basis of logic alone. This passage has taken a life of its own on apart from its context. The famous philosopher and ethical skeptic J.L. Mackie says that Hume's is-ought paragraph, which is how we refer to it, addresses how and by what faculty we discern the difference between vice and virtue. And he's saying it isn't on the basis of facts and it isn't on the basis of reasoning from what is to what ought to be. So by so saying, he's correct, inasmuch as Hume did not say that ought was inaccessible, but he said it was inaccessible to reason alone. So here he goes on about this. He says, thus the course of the argument leads us to conclude that since vice and virtue are not discoverable merely by reason or by the comparison of ideas, it must be by means of some impression or sentiment, that word's important, that they occasion, that we are able to mark the difference betwixt them. Our decisions concerning moral rectitude to be good and depravity to be bad are evidently perceptions, and as all perceptions are either impressions or ideas, the exclusion of the one is a convincing argument for the other. Morality, therefore, is more properly felt than judged of. It's more in the realm of our feelings, though this feeling or sentiment is commonly so soft and gentle that we're apt to confound it with an idea. He's saying we get mixed up. We're doing something that's coming from our passions, from our feelings, from our sentiment, and we think it's coming from our reason, according to our common custom of taking all things for the same which have any near resemblance to each other. So what Hume is saying here is that vice and virtue are not discoverable merely by reason. We've got to get to them in a different way. According to Hume, the faculty or aspect of human cognition, of human thinking or sentience, which can access these values is sentiment, passion, feeling, not just unaided reason. So Mackie succinctly states the popular position in ethics today that says one cannot reason from fact to value, a view which claims the above paragraph from Hume's reason as its primary foundation, Hume's treatise rather, as its primary foundation. But on the whole, says Mackie regarding what Hume wrote, his doctrine means that moral distinctions do not report any objective features at all. They're not factual. Moral goodness or rightness is not any quality or any relation to be found in or among objective situations or actions, and no purely intellectual or cognitive procedure can issue in moral judgment. So this is kind of what Mackie has done, is he's summed up a whole school of thought that says we can't reason from the natural world to ethical oughts and ought nots, to ethical prescriptions. On this basis, many philosophers have concluded that we cannot get oughts from ises. We can't say You ought to do this on the basis of facts. We cannot make moral decisions on that basis. Facts and values are, in a sense, in their thinking, divorced. So it's not the facts of the natural world that we should look when we're making moral decisions. Human nature and the things that make for human well-being and thriving and flourishing, they cannot be the basis of an ethical system, according to this way of thinking. In this sense, then, ethics is not a matter of logic or facts. And the state of affairs, which prevailed in English and Scandinavian ethics in the mid-20th century on the basis of this kind of thinking, was one where ethics had been entirely relegated to a realm of opinion. There were no longer such things in the minds of philosophers as ethical facts, like this is wrong or this is right. There's no such thing as ethical facts. Such pronouncements were, in their opinion, they were merely expressions of their taste or their preference. What's very clear from reading Hume's treatise and his later work, which is a condensation of the ideas in the treatise, it's much smaller and thinner. It's sort of like the Reader's Digest condensed version of the treatise, is that Hume is not, he's absolutely not saying that we cannot reason from facts to values. Rather, what he's saying is that we cannot reason from facts to values by reason and logic alone. There's a missing element, passion or sentiment, that must come into the picture in order for us to reason rightly in the world of ethics. That's all he's saying. He's saying that our thought process, our logic, our reason, they have to be joined together with our feelings or our passion. So imagine that you see a man in the distance who's beating up on, this girl is a little bit older looking, but imagine a pre-pubertal youngster, maybe 12, 11 years old. You see this man beating her up, and it looks like perhaps he's not only going to beat her, but he's intending to molest her. When you see this with the brain, here's what Hume is saying. When you see this with your brain, that just registers in the brain as a fact. In order to motivate you to jump into this situation, to get involved, to somehow protect her, you've got to have that something rises up in your passions. Something inside of you that has to do with your emotions has to say, that's wrong, and I'm going to help her. And so that's what motivates you. So it's not that the fact of her being beaten has nothing to do with our ethical motivation, but that passion has to come into this in order to take and move us to do something about it. Otherwise, the facts are kind of inert. That's what he's saying. So this is going on with him. He says, however, were we to make sentiment itself the measure of moral right and wrong, ethics would become entirely subjective and very much relative to the moral reasoner. So here's how Hume corrects this. He says, if we examine the particular laws by which justice is directed and property determined, we shall still be presented with the same conclusion. He's been reasoning in this manner. The good of mankind is the only object of all these laws and regulations. What that means is, in no way is Hume opposed to the idea of us being motivated by facts. In fact, he's saying we ought to be. We ought to be motivated by the facts concerning what's good for human beings. Hume specifically goes on to say that familiarity with human nature and human circumstances are what must drive our thinking in ethics. This is still from his enquiry. He says, we may conclude, therefore, that in order to establish laws for the regulation of property, we must be acquainted with the nature and situation of man. This is an old way of speaking. He means of human beings. We need to know human nature. We need to know what is good for humans. We must reject appearances which may be false, though specious, and must search for those rules which are on the whole most useful and beneficial, meaning most useful and beneficial to people. The failure to take the facts of the natural world as regards the physical, cognitive, and psychosocial needs of human beings into consideration when addressing normativity seems a glaring and basic mistake of 20th century ethical philosophers. The norms of physical well-being used in the fields of medicine, nutrition, psychology, and the various sciences presuppose that there's a connection between fact and value. These differing fields depend upon evaluative premises for the actual definitions of what they claim constitutes health, which is to say that these disciplines, all these other disciplines other than ethics, marry value and fact, which makes it very odd that some people in the field of moral philosophy choose to divorce them. It just doesn't make any sense whatever. They have purposely misinterpreted, it seems purposely to me anyway, they've misinterpreted what Hume was saying and tried to divorce them and make ethics very abstract. If philosophy seeks to identify the good life, which it does, as per Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, then that life is a human life. If ethics seeks to identify right and wrong, then its measure must be defined in human terms. We can't get away from that. And Hume wasn't trying to. Well, so what? Here's what. You need to keep your capacity for compassion, empathy, and concern for others sharp. You don't want to be apathetic about injustice, prejudice, hatred, violence, or abuse. If you remember, I wrote a paper that you had to read about the problems of ethical relativism. And in there, you read a quote from the atheist philosopher Simon Blackburn. And he spoke of the moral defect of indifference to things which merit passion. Certain things ought to fill you with a passion, with feeling. And he's saying there's something wrong with you if you don't have passion about them. Keeping your ethical edge sharp requires caring about things that you ought to be passionate about. The only other thing I would add to this is, inasmuch as human beings are moved by sentiment, if you want to be a good arguer, a good debater, a good dialoguer in the field of ethics, you got to be careful. You've got to be careful that you do not use your personal charisma or charm or eloquence when you're arguing. Why do I say that? Well, because, think of the Star Wars movies, if you're familiar with them, and the idea of a Jedi mind trick. The Jedi mind trick works when the Jedi is there, but afterwards the person knows they've been used. If you try to motivate people ethically to think with you by using your charm or by using your charisma or your eloquence, that's not particularly deep or heavy, and it's only able to work while you're there saying those things. But if you use the things that make for human flourishing, for human well-being, for human good, if you use those things in terms of arguments concerning what helps human beings to thrive, to have eudaimonia, a term that you're going to discover a little bit further in the course, if you argue in that fashion, then when you're gone, your arguments will still remain, and they will still be persuasive.